The prosecutor smirked, the judge barely looked up, and the officers sat back, waiting for the gavel to seal another conviction. But just as the verdict was about to drop, the defendant made a move that no one saw coming. Jabari Ellington never imagined his weekend trip to Birmingham, Alabama would end in handcuffs. He had flown in for a guest lecture at the University of Alabama, a simple engagement about criminal justice reform. Ironic, considering what was about to happen. It started after dinner. He had just left a small soul food spot downtown, where an older couple had recognized him from a panel discussion a few months back. They had chatted for a while, talking about systemic issues, the work that still needed to be done. Jabari was used to these conversations. What he wasn't used to was what happened next. As he crossed the street toward his rental car, the flashing blue and red lights made him pause. A patrol car pulled up fast, tires screeching to a halt. "Hands where I can see 'em!" The voice was sharp, commanding. Jabari barely had time to register what was happening before two officers, both white, both young, jumped out, guns drawn. "Sir, what's this about?" Jabari kept his voice steady, hands raised. He'd taught students how to handle police encounters, had studied every angle of these situations. But theory and reality were two different things. "Shut up! Turn around! Hands on the car!" A third officer stepped out of the patrol car, older, heavier, with a smirk that made Jabari's stomach turn. He watched as one of the younger cops pulled out a small plastic bag, white powder inside. "Look at that," the older cop chuckled. "What do we got here?" Jabari's body stiffened. Planted evidence. He had seen the cases, read the reports, even worked on overturning convictions based on this exact scenario. And now, it was happening to him. "That's not mine," he said, forcing himself to remain calm. "You know that's not mine." The officer tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Is that right?" He turned to his partner. "What do you think, Miller? Think he's telling the truth?" "Not a chance," the younger cop, Miller, replied with a grin. "Looks guilty to me." The handcuffs clicked around Jabari's wrists. People on the street had stopped to watch. A few pulled out their phones, but the officers weren't worried. They had done this before. They knew how to handle it. "Please, let me record," a woman started, but the older cop cut her off. "Back up, ma'am, unless you want to join him." Jabari's mind was racing. He could fight back, not physically, but legally, logically. He could insist they check for fingerprints, review the body cam footage, call a lawyer. But he knew how this game worked. They would turn off the cameras. The evidence would disappear. The charges would stick. So he stayed quiet. In the patrol car, the older cop sat in the front seat, whistling. "You got family, son?" Jabari ignored him. "You know it's funny," the cop continued. "All you boys got the same story. I didn't do it. I was just minding my business." Same tired lines. "We could recite 'em in our sleep." The younger cop, Miller, laughed. "Maybe we should start betting on which one we hear next." Jabari stared out the window, fists clenched. He wanted to tell them who he was. He wanted to see the look on their faces when they realized. But not yet. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The Jefferson County Courthouse was packed that morning. Reporters, attorneys, law students sitting in the back just to observe. It wasn't unusual. Cases like this always drew a crowd. A black man accused of drug possession. A swift trial. A predictable outcome. Jabari sat at the defense table, hands resting calmly on the surface. His public defender, a young, overworked attorney named Brian LeClaire, flipped through paperwork, his stress evident in the way he tapped his pen against the folder. "Listen, man," Brian whispered, leaning in. "I've seen these cases before. Judge Stokes? Not exactly known for being lenient. Your best bet is to take the deal." Jabari turned his head slightly, studying him. "And what's the deal?" Brian sighed. 5 years. Maybe 3 if you keep your head down and don't make any noise." 3 years, Jabari repeated, his voice smooth, calm. "For something I didn't do." Brian shifted uncomfortably. "I hear you. But these guys—" He glanced over at the prosecution's table, where Assistant District Attorney Joel Patterson was chatting casually with the officers who had arrested Jabari. The same officers who had planted the drugs. They were laughing, exchanging inside jokes, relaxed. Like they had done this 100 times. And they probably had. You fight this, Brian continued in a hushed tone. And you lose? You're looking at 20. Jabari let his eyes drift to the officers. Sergeant Raymond Givens, Officer Miller, Officer Denton. They weren't even pretending to be worried. Sergeant Givens caught Jabari's gaze and smirked, shaking his head slightly. A silent message. Don't even try. Jabari took a deep breath. Let's go to trial. Brian's pen tapping stopped. You sure? I'm sure. Brian hesitated, then gave a small nod. All right. The judge entered. Honorable Judge Howard Stokes, a man in his 60s with a reputation for swift sentencing. He settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses as he glanced over the case file. Let's make this quick, he muttered. Patterson stood, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, the state is prepared to proceed. We have clear and overwhelming evidence against the defendant. Jabari tuned him out. He already knew how this speech went. A routine performance. He had watched it play out in different courtrooms, in different states, against different people who never stood a chance. He felt the eyes of the room on him. The quiet anticipation. People expecting him to fold. The prosecution called Officer Denton first. Denton adjusted his uniform as he took the stand, placing a careful hand on the Bible before swearing in. Patterson approached him, exuding confidence. Officer Denton, let's go over the events of August 17th. Tell the court how you came into contact with the defendant. Denton cleared his throat. We were on patrol near 8th Avenue North, an area known for drug activity. We observed the defendant leaving a restaurant. When he spotted us, he immediately changed direction, appearing nervous. That's when we decided to conduct a stop. Jabari didn't react. He had expected this. Tell us what happened next, Patterson said. During the stop, the defendant refused to comply at first, asking unnecessary questions. Eventually, we conducted a lawful search, during which we discovered a small bag containing a controlled substance in his jacket pocket. Let the record show, Patterson turned to the jury, that the substance tested positive for cocaine. The murmurs in the room grew louder. A few spectators shook their heads. Jabari glanced at Brian, who wasn't even objecting. The public defender wasn't fighting this case. He was letting it happen. The next witness, Officer Miller, repeated the same script. Jabari barely listened. Then came Sergeant Givens. Unlike the others, he spoke with ease. Calm. Convincing. A man who had done this too many times to count. We follow protocol, Givens said, leaning forward slightly. No shortcuts. No misconduct. Everything we did that night was by the book. His voice was steady, filled with false sincerity. Patterson nodded. Thank you for your service, Sergeant Givens. No further questions. Brian stood up slowly. Jabari could tell he didn't want to cross-examine, but he had to at least make it look like he was trying. He cleared his throat. Sergeant, you're saying my client, Mr. Ellington, acted suspiciously. Did he run? No, Givens said smoothly. Did he resist? Givens smiled faintly. Not physically, no, but you still searched him. Based on probable cause, yes. Brian nodded slowly, turning the pages of his legal pad without actually reading them. And the drugs? Where exactly were they found? In his pocket, Givens answered without hesitation. Brian tapped his pen against the table again. No further questions. Jabari inhaled deeply. He was watching his own conviction play out in real time. The jury had already made up their minds. The officers were relaxed, Patterson was confident, and the judge was ready to move on. Jabari's gaze shifted back to Sergeant Givens, who looked almost amused. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. The courtroom air was thick with inevitability. Jabari could feel it, the weight of a verdict that had already been decided long before he ever stepped foot inside. Judge Stokes sighed, flipping through his notes as if skimming an article he had no interest in reading. The jury sat still, their expressions unreadable. Some had taken notes, others had just watched. waiting for the moment they knew was coming. Patterson stood. "Your Honor, at this time the prosecution rests its case." Brian barely hesitated before rising to his feet. "The defense has no further witnesses, Your Honor." No witnesses. No real defense. Jabari wasn't surprised. "Very well," Judge Stokes muttered. He removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes before looking toward the jury. "We'll move straight to closing arguments." Patterson didn't waste time. He walked toward the jury box, his movements deliberate, his voice steady. "Folks, this is simple. You heard the evidence. You heard from 3 trained officers, professionals with years of experience, who put their lives on the line every day to keep our communities safe. And then you heard from the defendant, a man who, let's be honest, just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." He paused, allowing his words to settle in. "But let's not forget," he continued, lowering his voice slightly, "that drugs don't just appear out of thin air. That cocaine didn't walk into his pocket by itself. And the law, our law, doesn't work on feelings. It works on facts." Patterson turned, walking back toward his table. "And the facts are clear," he said, gesturing toward Jabari without even looking at him. "You know what to do." He sat down, silent. Brian hesitated before standing up. He tugged at his tie, swallowed hard, then shuffled toward the jury with all the energy of a man who had already given up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, "I know this might seem like an open and shut case, but I ask you to consider, doubt. Reasonable doubt. Because even though Officer Denton, Officer Miller, and Sergeant Givens said what they said, it's important to remember that—" He hesitated. Someone coughed in the back of the courtroom. Brian cleared his throat. "What I'm trying to say is, we weren't there. We don't know for certain. And my client, well, he maintains his innocence. That was it. That was the defense." Brian nodded quickly and returned to his seat. Judge Stokes didn't bother hiding his impatience. "All right, the jury will now deliberate." But Sergeant Givens smirked. It was quick, barely noticeable. But Jabari saw it. The courtroom saw it. A smirk. A flicker of celebration. They had done this before, and they had never been caught. And that's when Jabari decided it was time. Before the judge could finish his sentence, Jabari leaned forward, his voice calm, steady, and unmistakably in control. "Your Honor," he said. The judge looked up, annoyed. "Mr. Ellington, your attorney had his turn." "I understand," Jabari interrupted, his tone polite but unwavering. "But before we proceed, I'd like to introduce myself properly." The tension in the room shifted. Jabari slowly stood. The bailiff took a step forward, but Judge Stokes held up a hand. "Let him speak." Jabari turned his gaze to Sergeant Givens. "You and your men did a very thorough job," he said. "You made sure the evidence was convincing. You even had a cooperative defense attorney to make sure nothing got in the way." Givens' smirk faded. Jabari nodded slowly, as if appreciating the effort. "And for any other man, this would have worked." His voice dropped slightly. "But I'm not just any man." The room was silent. Jabari reached into his pocket, the same jacket they had claimed to find drugs in, and pulled out a leather ID case. He flipped it open. The courtroom gasped. A golden badge, 3 bold letters at the top, FBI, and beneath it, Jabari Ellington, Director. The officers froze. Brian's face went pale. Judge Stokes leaned forward, eyes wide. "What?" Jabari's voice was quiet but powerful. "I am Jabari Ellington, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, "and I have everything I need to put all of you exactly where you planned to send me." For a moment, the entire courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that chokes the air, where even the faintest sound feels too loud. Then, like a crack in glass, the first reaction came. Judge Stokes pushed his chair back, his face unreadable, eyes flickering between the badge and Jabari's face. "Excuse me?" But Jabari didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. He held the FBI credentials up for everyone to see. The reporters in the back scrambled for their phones, snapping pictures, whispering urgently. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization. And the three officers? They weren't smirking anymore. Sergeant Givens sat frozen, his knuckles white against the table. Officer Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Denton, who had been so confident on the stand, so sure of the script, looked like he might be sick. Jabari turned his attention to the prosecution table. "Mr. Patterson," he said, his voice still calm, "would you like to clarify how your office is handling cases built on fabricated evidence? Or should I continue?" The assistant district attorney blinked. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Jabari took a slow step forward. "No. All right." He placed the badge on the defense table before pulling out something else, a small black recorder. He pressed play. A low beep filled the courtroom. Then, voices. "You know, it's funny. All you boys got the same story." "I didn't do it," Givens' voice clear as day. Jabari watched as the color drained from the sergeant's face. "We could recite 'em in our sleep." The recording continued, playing back every smug word, every laugh from the back of that police car. Everything. And when it ended, the courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, reporters whispering frantically, phones recording. The scandal had just detonated in real time. Judge Stokes slammed his gavel down. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom!" But it was too late. Jabari looked at Givens, who was breathing hard now, his hand gripping the table as if he could hold reality in place. Jabari took another step forward. "I have hours of this," he said, his voice almost conversational. "Bodycam footage, dashcam footage, witness statements." He tilted his head slightly. "You didn't think I'd let this happen without a plan, did you?" Givens stood up so fast his chair toppled over. This is a setup." Jabari raised an eyebrow. "You mean like the one you pulled on me?" The words landed like a punch. Officer Miller paled. Denton looked toward the exit, sweat beading at his temples. "Your Honor," Patterson finally found his voice, standing up. I don't know what game the defense is playing, but this is highly irregular. I request—" "You request?" Jabari cut him off. "You don't get to request anything. In fact—" He turned toward the gallery. 3 men in dark suits had entered quietly during the chaos. Federal agents. Jabari nodded toward them. "Gentlemen, you know what to do." The agents moved in. Sergeant Givens stumbled back. "Now hold on. Raymond Givens," one of the agents said, pulling out handcuffs. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, perjury and falsification of evidence." The courtroom exploded again. Reporters were standing now, cameras flashing, people whispering frantically. Officer Miller tried to back away, but another agent grabbed his wrist, securing his hands behind his back. Denton didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. Judge Stokes, still gripping his gavel, turned to Jabari. His expression had shifted, his usual courtroom arrogance replaced by something else. You orchestrated this," he said slowly. Jabari held his gaze. "No, Your Honor. They orchestrated it." He gestured toward the arrested officers. "I just refused to play along. For the first time that morning," he smiled. The courtroom had started as a trap, but now it had become something else entirely, a reckoning. The courtroom was in chaos. The once smug officers were now in handcuffs, their heads down, their faces drained of color. Reporters fought for position, their microphones and cameras pointed at the spectacle. Jabari stood still, watching it all unfold. Sergeant Givens twisted against his restraints. "You have no idea what you're doing," he barked at the federal agent restraining him. "This is a mistake. I want my lawyer." The agent barely reacted. "You'll get one. In federal court." Officer Miller tried to speak, but his voice came out shaky. "It wasn't my idea. I was just—" "Save it," the agent muttered, leading him away. Denton, the quietest of the three, simply nodded. He wasn't fighting it. He knew it was over. The courtroom buzzed with a new kind of energy. Not just shock, but realization. The jury, who had been so close to convicting Jabari moments ago, now looked at him differently. Judge Stokes slammed his gavel again, though this time it did nothing to quiet the room. Enough, he barked. This is still my courtroom. Jabari turned to face him. Not anymore. The judge stiffened. Excuse me? Jabari picked up his FBI badge and slipped it back into his pocket. Your Honor, I'd advise you to stay seated. This investigation runs deeper than 3 officers planting evidence. We have enough documentation to re-examine dozens of cases in this courthouse. Corrupt judges, attorneys. He glanced at Patterson, who visibly tensed. And a whole network of officers who have been working together for years. This is bigger than me. Stokes's face went red. You... Jabari stepped closer. For the first time, the judge looked nervous. You signed off on hundreds of cases just like mine, didn't you? Jabari's voice was steady, unwavering. Rubber-stamped convictions without a second thought. How many innocent people have you sentenced? How many plea deals forced through because you refused to hear the truth? The judge said nothing. Patterson shuffled his papers, pretending to be busy, but Jabari wasn't finished with him either. And you, Jabari turned his attention to the prosecutor. You've built a career on cases like this. How many times have you looked the other way when the evidence didn't add up? Patterson cleared his throat, forcing a weak chuckle. Listen, I had no idea what these officers were up to. If I had known, I would have... Jabari raised a hand. Stop! The word landed like a hammer. You had a choice, Jabari said, stepping toward him. You had every opportunity to do the right thing, to question what didn't add up. But you didn't. You didn't care, because the system always worked in your favor. Patterson's mouth opened, then closed. No defense, no excuses. Not anymore, Jabari said. One of the federal agents leaned in. Sir, we'll be taking this further. Judge Stokes is on our radar. Patterson too. This is just the beginning. Jabari nodded. Good. He looked around the courtroom one last time. For the first time in his life, the tables had turned. No one was looking at him as a defendant anymore. Now, they saw him for who he really was. The jury lowered their eyes in shame. They had almost convicted an innocent man. How many times had they done it before? Brian, the defense attorney who had refused to fight, sat stiffly at the table, his hands gripping his files. He hadn't even bothered to ask Jabari who he really was. Do you want my advice? Jabari asked him. Brian hesitated. What? Jabari's voice was firm. Find a new job. Brian swallowed hard. He knew Jabari was right. The officers were escorted out, their heads hanging low. Reporters rushed after them, cameras rolling, the scandal now out in the open. Judge Stokes clenched his jaw but said nothing. And Patterson? He slowly sank into his chair, realizing that his career might be over. Jabari took a deep breath. It was over. But at the same time, it wasn't. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had ever been in his position, every innocent life destroyed by men like Givens, Miller, and Denton, by judges like Stokes, prosecutors like Patterson. Jabari picked up his briefcase and turned toward the exit. The whispers in the courtroom followed him. But he didn't look back, because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Justice isn't about what's written in the law, it's about who enforces it. Too many innocent people have been victims of a system designed to break them down. Too many officers, prosecutors, and judges hide behind their power, believing that no one will ever challenge them. But the truth is, no one is untouchable. The fight for justice doesn't stop in the courtroom. It continues in every vote, every protest, every demand for accountability. So ask yourself, how many Jabari Ellingtons have there been? How many never got the chance to fight back? The system only changes when people stop being afraid to challenge it. If you believe in justice, share this story. Speak up. Because silence only protects the guilty. Subscribe for more stories that expose the truth.